Good afternoon, and welcome to our Faculty Research Colloquium. I'm so glad you could join us. I'm Sylvester Johnson. I direct the Center for Humanities, and I want to begin by thanking Joe Ford, who's the director of the Athenaeum, the digital hub at Virginia Tech, and to Dominique Francesca, the business manager for the Center for Humanities, for all their work to make this event possible. I also want to remind our audience that about half past the hour, we will open up the event to receive questions and comments from you. So please, if you'd like to go ahead and send those, you can do so in the Q&A feature of the webinar in your Zoom window, or you can wait until we do the Q&A. If you're joining us through the YouTube live stream, you can enter your comments or questions through the comments box. Well, today we are joined by Professor Danille Christensen. Very excited that she will be speaking with us today. Dr. Danille Elise Christensen holds a PhD in folklore from Indiana University, where she learned to pay close attention to the pattern things that people say, make, and do in the course of their daily lives. Her work explores why the taken for granted matters. Broadly concerned with rhetorics of vernacular performance, she combines archival and ethnographic research with close analysis of texts, objects, and technologies, and she focuses on the ways that social hierarchies are maintained and refigured through discursive and material means. Her research into football game day celebrations, a slack key guitar, scrapbooks, and food preservation has examined the choices involved in shaping these things and events, both literally and ideologically. She's writing a book. It's a study of how and why home canning has been promoted in the United States over the last century or so. Grew out of a 2016 Kluge Fellowship at the Library of Congress, and the book concentrates on how repeated canning enthusiasms reflect varied social and technological contexts on even as they bolster fairly stable notions about who possesses legitimate, even authoritative knowledge. In August of 2015, Christensen joined the faculty here at Virginia Tech in our Department of Religion and Culture as an assistant professor of public humanities, where she works with undergraduates in American Studies and Appalachian Studies, and with graduate students pursuing the material, culture, and public humanities degree. So welcome, Danille. So glad you could join us. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I am grateful for that introduction, Sylvester, and for the invitation to speak with you all today. I appreciate the labor and the care of those who are making this virtual event possible. As Sylvester mentioned, for several years, I've been working on a book called Freedom from Want, Home Canning in the American Imagination. Perhaps I took too literally this definition of the humanities, a field of allied disciplines that explore how people process experience. Drawing on my degrees in English, biology, American studies, and folklore studies, and integrating rhetorical analysis, ethnographic fieldwork, and archival research, I consider who has promoted home canning in the US over the last century or so and why. But what, you may ask? Looking at this photo of Sadie Miller, do pickled beets have to do with regimes of knowledge? As a discipline, folklore studies has always been interested in knowledge production, brokerage, and transmission. From the Grimm brothers' creation of core national knowledge during Germany's invention in the 19th century to narrative interpretations of unfolding events, genres such as rumor or legend that circulate outside and often comment upon dominant power structures. Folklorists attend to the logics of vernacular belief and to the humanistic aspects of scientific rhetoric and practice. Sometimes I explain my own abiding interest, as Sylvester just mentioned, in what have been called the domestic arts by saying that I explore why the taken for granted matters. This framing signals my disciplinary interest in epistemological assumptions and consequences. Working with a range of forms and in varied sites, folklorists like myself demonstrate how human knowledges have been named, celebrated, marginalized, abandoned, repatriated, and reframed, and with what consequences. We are interested in knowledge regimes, and in particular, the way that knowledge claims acquire social authority. In this 1995 photo, for instance, Sadie Miller gives folklorist Mary Hufford a tour of her cellar, a common practice, not one reserved for curious ethnographers. Displays of home bottled goods in private settings and in adjudicated public ones, like state and county fairs, assert that one possesses this knowledge, skill, and creativity to produce goods that are, in the words of scholar and craftsman David Pye, both sound and comely. Throughout my presentation, I'll speak to other mechanisms for establishing authoritative knowledge. But first, some background on my primary subject of study. In the United States, home canning means preserving fruit and vegetables by processing them in hermetically sealed containers at temperatures that render the food preparation shelf stable. The required amount and duration of heat differs based on the inherent acidity of the base food, the amounts of sugar or vinegar added, the altitude of the physical environment, which affects boiling point, and other factors. It is a practice that has waxed and waned in general popularity over the decades. So here on the screen, you see some New Deal era canners. And right now we're in the midst of another canning revival, one that emerged during the Great Recession and got another boost from pandemic gardening. Today, under the rubric of canning, we tend to lump jams, jellies, and pickles together with bottled applesauce, vegetable soup, and green beans. It's come to mean anything in a mason jar. Historically, however, nomenclature separated preserving from plain canning. The distinction got me thinking about two domains, art and science, that began diverging in the 17th century and became fully distinct in English by the mid-1800s. The category preserving included items that depended on high sugar or high acetic or lactic acid content, thus minimizing bacterial and fungal growth, and, it turns out, creating an environment hostile to the spores of Clostridium botulinum, the source of botulism toxin. Preserving techniques date back to the days of clay containers and closures made from pitch or paper or animal bladders. And preserves have always been prestige foods, requiring time, space, precious sugar and spices, varied and abundant produce, and personal taste in both senses of that word. Often, the highest ranking female servant or the house's mistress herself would preside over their production. A portrait of a British heiress painted in 1613 included, in the words of journalist Hilary Spurling, a couple of liquor stills and her household receipt book displayed in the background like the trophies of learning or war. And a British domestic dictionary printed more than 300 years later noted that preserving, far from being mechanical, afforded scope for artistic fancy. Canning, on the other hand, referenced a newer process that aimed to maintain the natural taste of a greater range of foods by relying not on additives, but on heat and a vacuum seal. By at least the late 17th century, chefs and householders were heating submerged, provisionally sealed, unsugared bottles of small acidic fruits in order to preserve them for use in winter tarts. However, the desire for universal, context-independent processes ramped up in the ultra-rationalizing 18th century, and at the beginning of the 19th century, Francis Nicolas Appert published a process that would potentially allow every type of food, including vegetables, meats, and soups, to be bottled in exactly the same nearly fresh way. But it turns out, when applied to this broader range of foods, plain canning can also create just the low oxygen, low acid, low competition environment that fosters botulism toxin. It is no accident then that we still recognize jams, jellies, and pickles, whose food chemistry allows for greater creativity and production, as artisanal, while high stakes, literally life or death, plain canning is couched in the language of technology-assisted measurement and scientific prescription. This presentation examines both processes, preserving and canning, in relation to broader discourses about how knowledge and knowers are made, classified, and ranked. Talk about home-bottled fruits and vegetables can tell us much about knowledge regimes, including the segregation of art from science, that split's enduring consequences, and what we might gain from integrating them, or at least considering them alongside each other. Most histories of canning begin with Nicolas Appert, so let's start there too. Appert became the darling of colonels and colonizers when, in 1810, he published The Art of Preserving, for several years, all animal and vegetal substances, a process that, when scaled up, he correctly envisioned as crucial to the health of sailors and the establishment of global trading, conquest, and settlement. The word art had meant skill since medieval times, when universities designated 7 fields of human will and effort, later called the liberal arts: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. By the 16th century, artists could refer to any skilled person, including those exploring space and numbers, but the word was becoming more aligned with those skilled in the arts overseen by the muses: history, poetry, comedy, tragedy, music, dancing, and still astronomy. A confectioner by trade, Appert probably used art in the title of his publication in both its technical and its aesthetic senses. When historians of canning talk about Nicolas Appert, however, they generally emphasize today's sense of science. He becomes the father of canning, a lab-based inventor. And some do qualify his work as merely empirical, but that's a question we can talk about later. For instance, in terms of sort of positioning him in terms of science, chroniclers, including this 1950s era pamphlet, draw attention to his steady investigations of a specific problem. Some great inventions have been stumbled upon by accident, but not the art of canning, wrote journalist J.H. Collins in a 1922 article published in the trade journal The Canning Age. He praised Appert's close observation and limitless patience in the face of repeated failures. Writing in 1981, another scholar opined that Appert's, quote, great contribution was that he planned methodical experiments, verified them by exact observations, and drew logical conclusions, represented here by the chart that links specific foods to specific durations of heat processing. Let me pause for a moment to suggest how this language of recorded experiment aligns Appert with art and science. Before 1600, the word experience and the word experiment, both from the Latin experire, to try or to put to the test, were often interchangeable ways to refer to knowledge gained through sensory perception. And early modern books sometimes used experiment, receipts, and recipes synonymously, those words synonymously, echoing the medieval meaning of experimenta, which referred to medical remedies that had been vouched for by a firsthand observer, but that had not been predicted and could not be explained within the framework of Galenic or medicine, like the balancing of the humors. These, quote, fortuitous practical discoveries, the experimenta, were common in vernacular recipe books, but experimenta also found place in more authoritative collections. By Shakespeare's time, experience was coming to mean awareness of previous trials, a way to reference knowledge gained by participating in the world generally. Experiment, what Raymond Williams calls a noun of action, was narrowing to mean the observation of a particular test. In the 17th and 18th centuries, with the ascent of mechanistic worldviews, the terms continued to diverge. Experiments became events planned to illustrate the rational order of nature, while experience accrued both a practical meaning as customary behavior, so connected to art as skill, and the sense of inner or subjective knowing that became, by the time Appert died in 1841, firmly aligned with art as expression. Appert's own self-presentation reflects these rhetorical and etymological shifts. When he first introduced himself to government officials, he called himself a confectioner. In his own words, he said he was raised in the art of preparing and preserving alimentary products by the known methods, with more than 45 years experience working in and supervising cellars, confectionaries, distilleries, and groceries. But as Restoration France embraced a new episteme in the 1820s, Appert sought to base his authority on his identity as a property holder, as a citizen, and finally as a scientist, rather than as a skilled practitioner. 1803 legislation had specifically barred women from access to scientific education and the practice of medicine. At the same time, legal reforms made public cooking jobs more available to women, and, writes historian Jennifer Davis, gastronomic writing sought to subordinate cooks to diners' whims. This double erosion of prestige prompted male cooks to bolster their expertise using the rhetoric and institutions of science. Thus, in 1825, Appert began writing chimiste after his signature. He wrote that his discovery of advertising was the result of his long hours of culinary labor and devotion to the advancement of knowledge, including sleepless nights and endless rounds of research and experimentation. Further, his tests were driven by basic principles. He explored the role of air and heat in preservation. Today, many of us take the authority of science as a given, but ceding final say to institutionally credentialed experts is a learned behavior. In urbanizing America, for instance, this impulse gathered steam from the mid-19th century onward, bolstered, as Melanie Keachel has shown, by professional science societies, accredited schools, and the development of exclusive workspaces like laboratories, new forms of discourse, like scientific jargon, and adjudicating institutions like boards of health that favored visual, quantified evidence and decreased the authority of laypersons and the importance of holistic context. Laboratories, in fact, might be defined as places where things are isolated in order to be made visible. Part of the work of Enlightenment era labs, for instance, was to distinguish scientists, the alleged brains, from technicians, the ones who put the labor in laboratory. Annette Singh writes that the assumption of self-containment in labs made an explosion of new knowledge possible. Indeed, with reference to our topic today, by 1895, Belgian Emile van Ermegen had killed lab animals using a colorless, tasteless toxin produced by C. botulinum. thus linking a rare paralytic disease to the gram-positive bacteria. By 1917, the USDA popularized studies that linked low-acid foods to toxin production and high heat to spore destruction, and so they recommended pressure canning for meat and vegetables. Knowledge offered by USDA agents and home economists was distinct from traditional homemakers' know-how, writes Anne Velisis, in that it referred primarily to a realm that couldn't be seen or sensed firsthand. This gave home economists tremendous authority. I don't have time to go through all this rapidly emerging knowledge here, but just know that by the time America entered World War I, long familiar techniques and official recommendations and explanations overlapped in confusing ways, sometimes changing dramatically from year to year. These recommendations were complicated by the context in which knowledge was created, received, and practiced. Clostridium botulinum is an agent whose actions and effects are influenced by geography, container material, lid type, heating technique, processing equipment, human goals, and the other organisms in and characteristics of its environment. As you can see from these World War II era instruction manuals, as new knowledge and new technologies piled up in the first decades of the 20th century, even official instructions grew confusing and old knowledges didn't always transfer cleanly or safely. Caution notices are scattered throughout this poster set, warning against trying previously adequate, even cutting-edge techniques with new technologies. It is partly this proliferation, I believe, that eventually conflating preserving and plain canning, subsuming both processes under a framework of fear of explosion, of paralysis, of death, and in a framework of compliance with the instructions of credentialed authorities. I do acknowledge that there are real health risks involved in food processing, and especially in the bottling of vegetables and meat. Old recipes don't always work as people move to new physical contexts, use new equipment or containers, try new hybrids and food combinations. In 2004, for instance, the introduction of airtight zip closure plastic bags led to increased incidence of botulism among Alaska natives who use them to store marine foods preserved according to traditional recipes. Adding lemon juice to fig preserves, salsas, and nowadays to sweet tomato hybrids is not just for better flavor, it's to ensure a safe pH level. So up-to-date canning guidelines are important, and I encourage you to consult the National Center for Home Food Preservation at the University of Georgia for more specific information about current recommendations. That said, throughout the rest of our conversation today, I ask you to keep in mind the complex relationship between the ubiquitous but generally harmless microorganism botulism, Clostridium botulinum, and its context. So back to science. Another ways that the rhetoric and appeal of science was underscored was in the language and dress of the laboratory, which were embraced during these confusing decades at the beginning of the 20th century. So here we have an example of schoolgirls singing songs and wearing uniforms in canning clubs, even as they turned their own plots of land into controlled experiments geared toward commodity production. Miss Erin Dooley of Georgia, for instance, made a $91.50 profit on her tomatoes after isolating a single variable, here type of fertilizer, and comparing yields. As Elizabeth Engelhardt and others have documented, canning clubs in the first decades of the 20th century drew girls who relished the opportunity to experiment and to quantify, to set up businesses and earn their own money, to work with and even construct their own machinery. Like Nicolas Appert, they also kept good records. Home economics and domestic science also work to legitimate domestic skills and knowledge by adopting the space and structures of the laboratory. Here we see women in the late 1920s preparing a nutritious meal using previously bottled goods. And outdoor spaces could be rationalized as well, with this clean and airy community cannery employing young African-American women, probably in a USDA-sponsored club, to tin jars assembly line style. I want to turn now from canning and science to preserving and practice, or art. Too often, discourses separating experience from experiment and experiment from theory end up reducing the arts of noticing to mere guesswork. Preserving in the 19th century sense relies primarily on tacit knowledge, that is, embodied skill, things we know but cannot necessarily tell, what Heinz Ott-Sibum has called gestural knowledge, the precise way that jam drags the spoon when it is almost ready to set, the look of good mold versus bad mold on the top of fermenting sauerkraut. And people still use the tests that are on the screen here to establish a gel point without using thermometers or artificial pectin. Some commercial entities have recognized these embodied modes of assessment as tacit knowledge. For instance, the scouring powder ad from 1922 assumes that visual evaluations can ensure an exemplary level of germlessness. In the mid-1950s, Kerr advertised two-piece lids that, quote, can be tested in every known way, hear, see, or feel the seal. Tapping the lid with a spoon, for instance, brought uniformly reliable results. If the spoon rang high and clear, the jar was sealed. Plain canning, here on the left, also involves gestural knowledge, how to navigate delicate pear halves with spoons so they land core side down, for instance. But over the course of the 20th century, as cooking was institutionalized as part of domestic science and a linked home canning industry emerged, credentialed professionals devalued older assessment techniques and collapsed the EMIC categories of preserving and canning, framing both as a dangerous enterprise best directed by experts. For instance, Fanny Farmer of Boston Cooking School fame and author of the first cookbook to use standardized measurements, she recognized the validity of tacit knowledge and empirical praxis, but undercut it. Correct measurements, she said in 1896, are absolutely necessary to ensure the best results. Good judgment with experience has taught some to measure by sight, but the majority need definite guides. In 1920, a lecturer at London's Imperial Institute distinguished between modern canning methods and, quote, cottage methods for preserving fruit. The former used thermometers and pressure canners. The latter used visual methods, timed measures, and boiling water baths. Marketing posters from a US-based rubberine company noted that, quote, experts have to be particular. And in 1935, US-based bacteriologist Fred Turner would dismiss visual inspection of canned goods as, quote, cursory examinations because they could not detect decay at the microscopic level. Worry about whose knowledge counts as authoritative has been an ongoing issue when it comes to domestic labors. Consider this advice from a 1954 newspaper article. Jellies and jams can be fun to make if, 1, you know how to read, 2, you have a good recipe, 3, you have the basic utensils and ingredients. Following up on her first point, Dixie Oliver continues, it's amazing how many people can't read. A cup of granulated sugar means a cup of anything sweet, honey, brown sugar, syrup, sugar substitute. They're all the same to some. Then they can't imagine why the jelly didn't come out right. Non-sugar or brown sugar sweeteners actually have quite a history of use within food preservation, although it is true that the distinct chemical properties of each do change food outcomes if not applied with experience. But Oliver's sarcastic comment called attention to the semiotics of substitution, contending that the practice indexes ignorance and privileging print literacy and a willingness to follow directions. As we shall see, however, substitutions can also index creativity, resourcefulness, and an understanding of deeper culinary structures. And as historian Elaine Long has demonstrated, they've been an important part of cooking as knowledge making since at least the early modern period. Oliver continues, taking up her second point. A good recipe is important too. Those wonderful old recipes handed down from grandma worked for your mother, but only because she'd used and experimented with them many times. And there were probably frequent failures blamed on the bad weather or other insignificant factors. It's much better to rely on modern guides. Most of them have been tested more times than you'd care to count. Let's see if we can unpack the convolutions here. The inclusion of rely and guide reinforces the practice of obedience to external authority communicated through print channels. Then there's the conflation good with modern, in distinction to the diachronic links implied in old recipes handed down. Lodging outmoded knowledge in the figures of the grandmother and mother reinforces the idea of intergenerational knowledge as a specific type, and also genders that knowledge, bringing it into the realm of the dismissible old wives' tale. Grandmothers are forever appearing in or on instruction books, often as affectionate foils to, quote, better knowledge. After all, father knows best. As a mode of knowledge making, recipe collection, curation, trial, assimilation, and dissemination have historically been activities grounded in social relations and sociability, and in situated physical contexts that include factors like humidity and altitude. Nevertheless, using the verb blame, Oliver suggests that the women of yore had erroneous notions of causality. Most strikingly, Oliver notes that grandma's recipes have succeeded due to repeated empirical trials, even using the word experiment. But she then advocates abandoning them for other recipes that have been tested many times in apparently modern ways. Oliver's logic is muddy here, but she seems to be making a distinction between so-called trial and error, a process in which conclusions are reached through material observation and experience, versus the same kind of observation and assessment produced by experts. Her use of modern suggests specific spaces such as the sterile extra-domestic laboratory, people, apparently objective scientists, if not male, then certainly institutionally credentialed, and processes, such as theory-driven exploration of individual variables. Commercial interests help to perpetuate these knowledge hierarchies. The image that accompanied this 1954 article of a pert young woman with coiffed black hair, so not grandma, was wearing a ruffled gingham bib apron and holding a jelly jar of peach jam up to the light, was submitted to the newspaper by Sure-Gel and Certo. The names of these artificial pectin companies reveal their rhetorical commitment to universalizable and scalable applied knowledge. Their product works anytime, anywhere, without needing the experience with local environments or circumstances. Indeed, these companies actively work to reframe the tacit knowledge that for so long had positioned jam and jelly making as an art. Here, Certo suggests that guesswork, that is, knowing which precise combination of specific fruits, degree of ripeness, and length and style of cooking will yield a respectively firm jelly, this quote guesswork has been eliminated by the magic of artificial pectin. You might actually call that knowledge skill or art, or even empirical observation and experience, science even. In fact, early commercial jam producers were so proficient in tacit knowledge that when jam boiling thermometers were introduced about 1900 to indicate when the correct concentration of sugar for maximum jelly formation had been reached, they often preferred to trust their customary methods, looking at changes in the look of the liquid or doing the ages-old drip test. And these methods were seldom wrong. But sudden changes in barometric pressure could actually create misleading thermometer readings. So we have this label guesswork, which actually is a linguistic sleight of hand that spins this kind of embodied knowledge in just the opposite direction. In a related and classic application of Enlightenment rhetoric, commercial canning discourses also frame traditional knowledge in terms of the esoteric and the occult. This 1975 canning guide explains, traditionally man has provided food and woman has preserved it, but traditions change and roles switch. In fact, the canning process for preserving food was discovered by a man. The next paragraph describes Nicolas Appert's textually documented methodical experiments with sterilized, hermetically sealed bottles in the early 19th century. Then it continues, Appert's discovery made life easier for women who had to preserve summer harvests for winter nourishment. And so home canning soon became a family tradition, with one generation of women passing their special canning secrets along to the next generation. Like the suffrage-era Campbell soup ads that Catherine Parkin has analyzed, this 1975 manual co-opts feminist discourses. It raises the ideas of changing gender roles, increased freedoms, and distinctive kinds of knowledge, but it does so in order to reassert the authority of men. That is, even in regard to women's work, men did it first, and they did it more rationally. That is, men discover and women have secrets. In this account, empirical knowledge is dismissed as magical, tradition is merely received, rather than based on repeated trial and observation. Here's yet another reframing of knowledge that can be known but not told. As I've written about elsewhere, canning has persistently been associated with luck and superstition, both in the home realm and in reference to small-scale canners operating before the advent of germ theory and industry consolidation. So these sources will refer to locked rooms, occult science, successful products being miracles, jam being brewed in witches' cauldrons. There's all these kinds of associations. Scholars like Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett and James Scott have written persuasively about secrets or hidden transcripts as a way to exert agency and control, a strategy that I found in my work with scrapbook makers. In part, science has been all about revealing a feminized nature's secrets. Science becomes a form of exposure and control and atomization of parts, including through textualized practices. Secret recipes are those that are not written down. So let me now turn to record keeping as a form of knowledge making. Much contemporary canning discourse embraces the finalized text in the Bakhtinian sense, unresponsive to context, unsuited for emendation, and saturated with self-sufficient authority. These are the modern guides referenced in the 1954 New York Sun article we looked at, and implied in the multitude of exhortations canners get to, quote, just follow directions. The opposite of this kind of finalization is the empirical process known as trial and error. And when canning histories talk about the days before laboratories and germ theory, they are prone to describe knowledge making as haphazard and capricious. People hit upon or stumble upon ideas, getting vague realizations. Yet in her 2018 book, Recipes in Everyday Knowledge, historian Elaine Long examines the ways that householders in early modern England operated within a different textual ideology as they collected, tested, assimilated, and exchanged receipts for food and medicines. She examines a range of written records, letters, collated scraps of paper, rough pocket-filled notebooks, working with books filled with annotations and marginalia and Eaton's gift books. And she discovers within them clues to the ways that recipe practices comprise forms of knowledge based in sociability, accretive and flexible in form, prone to addition and substitution, and oriented toward praxis that she refers to as know-how. Cooks themselves have long approached cooking through the lens of careful testing and evaluation, developing a range of marginal marks and other techniques to select, accept, reject recorded practical knowledge. So you can see that in this recipe, which is actually one of the earliest recipes that predate and pre-view a pear's technique, right? There's this cross in the margin that shows that it worked. Other symbols included hearts, trefoils, circles, dots, diagonal lines, and you can often see multiple readers engaging in marking text. In this 1679 book, for instance, the author stars the directions that she has approved, and people would write proved or cured, and other kinds of abbreviations in the margins as well. The compiler links the recipes to individuals by using their initials. And this attention to provenance allowed people to go back and query the donors of the recipes, and so they could sort of work out this knowledge together. This recipe, written in the late 1680s, attributed to Mrs. Mills and marked with the commendation with an asterisk, you can see up there in the top left corner. It is also quite similar to the method that Appert published more than a century later. So you can see that these recipes are circulating much earlier and are being approved by people. And you can't see it well here, but someone has cross-hatched through an entire recipe in an early 19th century cookbook. It is also an example of one of the pre-Appert bottled gooseberry recipes, but instructs the maker to cork the bottles after they've been heated, which would allow space for contamination in the space between scalding and sealing. When the recipe proved faulty, the user marked it as such. And I've seen this in other books as well, including one from 1740. In early modern times, these recipes, not only did they function as ways to approve or reject knowledge, but they were little presents, small constant reminders of affection and regard within the complex gift economy of early modern England. Collating know-how was part and parcel of long-term household provisioning and management. And these practices of sociability and sharing exist in the construction of domestic knowledge today. You can see here's one example of women who are working together, probably in Western North Carolina, between 1925 and 1930. They're doing both water bath and pressure canning. And here is a demonstration of women getting together to attend a canning demonstration in a park before World War I. All right. To close out this section, I just want to return to this image of Sadie Miller, whose hands are marked with the beets that she found great pleasure in bottling, using knowledge of how to rub off the skins easy. Her practice, like those of the 18th century recipe writers, is hands-on, grounded in unapologetic social context of learning and sharing. As I wrap up, let me point to some contemporary examples of how knowledge and social hierarchies are constructed and problematized within the world of home canning today. In 2014, I learned about the Ball Fresh Tech automatic home canning system. It capitalizes on the social value of sharing homemade foods and pitches itself as a solution for busy households, perhaps working moms. In any case, they say it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. Literally, you pick one of 28 jam, jelly, pickle, tomato, salsa, or sauce recipes, prepare 6 half-pint or 3-quart jars, load the jars, push the button that corresponds to your recipe, and walk away. As the online description declares, this machine and its, quote, 7 built-in safety features take the guesswork out of canning. Finally, it suggests, canners will be able to can a safe product with minimal effort. But this canner is essentially an electric water bath. It's not a pressure canner, so it can't even process the foods that introduce a risk of botulism. In other words, it can only do the old school work of preserving. So the guesswork referred to here is really tacit knowledge. Comments on the product's website make it clear that most reviewers dislike the confines of this automated, or dare I say finalized system, wanting the freedom to experiment with recipes, can all types of foods, and further develop their own skills. They know that the canner works on the logic of fear, of botulism, and of guesswork, and fosters dependency in the process. There are a number of vernacular responses to such assertions, including this meme, which was posted on the Callaway, Virginia Community Cannery's Facebook page 2 years running. It threatens canning police trolls with their own worst nightmare, being contained using non-recommended methods, and that is makeshift equipment. And decades earlier, Addie Mae Dotson of Lorman, Mississippi, responded to these denigrations of tacit knowledge in a different way. She opted to embrace so-called guesswork, using the term to describe her own experiments with cooking. She learned the art by watching her mother and never measures. She always seasons to taste. Describing how she sweetened the peaches she was putting up, she told folklorist Bill Ferris, "I just put guesswork at it, and more or less when I guesswork at it like that, it comes out sweet enough for me, and I don't know about the other fella." She approves this method even in the face of possible disagreement from others. And later in the interview, she affirms her own experience again. "I can taste it. I can guesswork in the kitchen cooking, and I betcha I come out with my food seasoned right." So in conclusion, in 2018, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine issued a report that took as its grounding metaphor Albert Einstein's observation that all religions, arts, and sciences are branches from the same tree. The report advocated integrating humanistic, artistic, scientific, and technological knowledges and forms of evidence in post-secondary education, celebrating existing insights and fostering emergent ones. Problem-based projects, multifaceted scholastic communities, holistic programs of study, and other forms of integration, they wrote, led to positive educational and career outcomes that included written and oral communication skills, teamwork skills, ethical decision-making, critical thinking, and the ability to apply knowledge. More importantly, the authors noted, an educated and open mind empowers the individual to separate truth from falsehood, superstition and bias from fact, and logic from illogic. I am all for the integration of knowledge regimes, but it is exactly this neat separation of the world into superstition and fact that I've questioned in my presentation today. At a time when novel pathogens, unsettled environments, and unfettered opinion are causing social and material disruption, it is tempting to find comfort in the stability of binary oppositions, disciplinary categories of expertise, and principles derived from large-scale laboratory testing. In crisis, we cast about for valid and useful knowledges, looking for the reassurance of apparently objective fact, at the same time that we take comfort in what may seem to be more objective or intuitive ways of knowing, such as narrative, parody, music, or history. This kind of mess and complexity may be just what we need. Thanks to Raymond Williams' etymological work in keywords, we know that during the early modern period, science, from the Latin scientia, could mean being cognizant of something generally, as distinguished from conscience, that is, knowing something with conviction and commitment. Today, we might frame this science-conscience split as a contrast between theory, theoretical knowing, and praxis, or active knowing. I believe that, especially if the humanities reclaim the arts in their broader and practical sense, attending to emplaced, material-constrained practices like canning and preserving, the humanities deliberations about conduct and value offer a way to integrate conscience and committed context-specific knowing in an academy that too often values truth in the form of prescription. Experiential learning is one such way to integrate, and it's a reason I often have my students do many apprenticeships with what we often call artisans. I try to take to heart the words of my mentor, Dory Noyes, that knowledge without context is unsafe, and knowledge without obligation confers power that is subject to abuse. We need, in short, to cultivate across the academy what Anna Singh has called arts of noticing, not only in the controlled environment of the laboratory, but also at the unruly edges of messy, concrete utterances and encounters, where the careful observer can shed light on big histories by paying attention to insistent, if humble, details. Recognizing the constraints of materiality, as in preserving, tempers the impositions of universals, reminding us to guard against hubris and framings based in fear, and to think more about the context in which universals are meted out. It matters how we tell the story and whose voices we include. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Danille. It was really fascinating. Lots of really surprising, and at least to me, some surprising intersections of the tensions between the technology and cultural practices of corporations, individual consumers, the role of advertising, and lots of community knowledge, and so much that you've been able to share with us. So I want to remind those who are in the audience that we would welcome your comments and questions. If you're on the Zoom webinar, the app, you can look at the bottom of your Zoom window and there's a Q&A button. Please feel free to click that and you can send us your questions or comments. If you're joining us through the YouTube Live format, you can just click the comments window and you can enter your questions or comments there, and we'd be happy to relay those to Danille so that she can respond to them. And there are already a number of questions that could be asked about and are about what you're really showing here. You know, as you were talking through this, though, Danille, you were reminding me of something a saying my mother shared, because they did a lot of canning, and this was before they even had a refrigerator. You'd say you eat all you can, and what you can't, you can't, so that you could preserve it, because you either ate it fresh, there was no sticking something in the freezer or the refrigerator. You canned it so that you could use it sometime later. But one of the things that I'd love to ask you, you talked about, I would love for you to give us your more direct sense of this, is whether you, having done this research, see canning as being science or an art.
Well, I think that I would like to avoid that dichotomy, really.
Darn! I thought I was going to trap you.
I mean, I think that
you're critiquing that dichotomy, of course.
I am critiquing that dichotomy. I do think that once we decided that we wanted to apply the same process to every food under the sun, that we moved into this realm of well, let me back up and say that for centuries there was this very diverse set of food preservation practices that were specifically key to particular kinds of foods, particular kinds of places, right? So you dry your beans and your corn, and you can dry apples, but you want to pickle meats and cucumbers, right? And then fruits that you can preserve using a sugar, or you can dry them. And when so there's this like carefully attuned sense of what can be done with what, and that because people had learned what would keep and what wouldn't, right? They then within those sort of more specialized practices had more leeway to be creative. Whereas when sort of canning in its universal application was introduced, that did really move it into the realm of science and prescription, because of that whole range of contexts that had to be controlled at the same time. And so I think that distinction is something that I'm really interested in, because I get frustrated when people look at practices that fall outside of contemporary prescribed norms and say that the people who are doing those other kinds of practices are stupid or ignorant or uninformed, when in fact they may be practicing in very specific kinds of contexts with specific specialized knowledge. So I just think we need to be more careful about how we evaluate particular people's applications of knowledge.
Oh, of course. I think that was really crystallized in the closing that you gave at the end of your presentation. I thought I'd just ask a crass question so you could reinforce your answer for our audience. Yes, that is but very compelling. I think you've shown. I was fascinated by even your inclusion of the etymological history of some of these terminologies of techne and technology and science to just show that science has for a long time has meant knowledge, and not just some knowledge, but knowledge, not a piece of it, and not under certain kinds of institutional contexts, but knowledge. And
Well,
that
and what
there's
was
lots of
fascinating
expertise.
as I was going through the etymological changes and the technological changes is the ways that there's also no clear distinction about when people stopped using one use of the term, right, and when another started. And so just in the same ways that kinds of jars or closures have overlapped as people continue using what works for them, right, and types of techniques have overlapped. These uses of terms are so fascinating because they are so intertwined and overlapping, and they kind of shade into nuances of new and innovative uses. So I like that. I've always liked the distinction or the ways that language and material practices are related to each other.
Yeah, no, there are lots of, I thought, very fascinating turns and ways that you're elucidating the histories of culture and institutions and the material that you shared with us. I did not realize that this was a nerve toxin. Clostridium botulinum is pretty serious. I just thought, well, if you're not preserving something correctly, maybe you get a little sick. But nerve toxin? Tell us about this.
So there are all sorts of horror stories that you could read, especially in the 1920s, partly because more people were canning in the context of World War I, but also because there were a range of new technologies, and there were like rubber shortages that were affecting the quality of seals, and just a whole range of factors came together, and there were several botulism outbreaks across the country in the late teens and the early 1920s, and some in home canning, others in commercial canneries. But it's interesting that in the literature that the sort of home sourced botulism, that's what really gets people's interest and excitement. Those are the stories that, these sort of lurid tales in newspapers about people killing the ones they love the most, right? Because whole families did die. It's a colorless, odorless toxin. There's some way that you can tell that things have started to spoil, but it sort of takes on the mythology of like radioactivity, right? Of this kind of risk or danger that is beyond our tacit knowledge, right? The things that we can sense and have experienced and learned from in the past. And so it is something to take seriously. If you are processing low acid foods, which would be vegetables and meats, if you're trying to do that without plain, right? Without added sugar, added acid, then that is a case when following directions is a good idea. But the mortality rate for botulism before 1950 was 60%. And since then, it's now about 15%, but it's also the incidence is super, super rare, right? So, but it is the kind of disease, because the symptoms are pretty horrifying, kind of, alive, but you're slowly, your lungs are becoming paralyzed, and most people, we end up dying of suffocation. It's something that scares people. And because preserving and canning has been lumped together, it means that people have become afraid to even do jams and jellies, for which there's a super, super, super low risk of ever getting botulism. But it's sort of this whole idea of fear that that pervades people's approach, and I think has them sort of cede their own autonomy in some ways to these commercial and institutional interests.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely sounds scary. So we have a couple of questions that were queued up, and one was asking about the guide to canning, and someone wants to know where they can get one of these guides for canning methods in prep time.
So I mentioned the National Center for Home Food Preservation at the University of Georgia, and that's a great source. You can find information on pretty much anything from freezing kale to making your own sausages. So it's a good source. It is important to know, because of the kinds of shifts that I talked about in my presentation, that just following the directions in a book that you find on the street, it might not be appropriate for the context that we're in now today.
Okay. And someone is asking that, and they give a disclaimer, this might be seen as a crass question, rather reductive, but they say that science self-consciously includes self-corrective procedures, and they're asking, do more traditional methods in canning also incorporate self-corrective procedures?
So, I mean, I think that when we're talking about the ways that people share recipes and evaluate recipes, and there's a lot of talk that goes on amongst people about what works and what doesn't, and so in those ways you have this sort of feedback that does address and identify issues that have come up in particular practice.
Another question concerns some of the specifics of this commercialization. So you were pointing to these tensions and the intentions through the advertising that showed both the utility of new products that were being sold in order to make it supposedly easier to do the preserving at home, and also that called into question or that sought to undermine these traditional methods and their knowledge or their expertise by suggesting that people should just rely on these commercial products. So could you say more about that in a way with their particular companies, for example, that capitalized on these efforts more than others? And were there any that were more successful than others in being able to capture the market and get more people to buy their products instead of using some of these traditional methods?
I would say that historically, there's been, as in most fields of commerce, a lot of contraction in the home canning industry in the last 40 years. And so now there is basically one company that produces almost all of the home canning materials in the United States, but still keeps the Ball brand and the Kerr brand and the things that people have developed loyalties to. I would say that historically, companies that have produced, they called home canning outfits or kits, were really, there was a lot of feedback between the consumer division of those companies and the public. And so, and there were home economists who were employed by those companies, could give personalized one-on-one feedback to consumers. And so my sense is from a lot of those earlier efforts, they were very much key to helping the customer in the ways that the customer is identified. Whereas like the Fresh Tech canner that I mentioned
Mhm.
is all about playing on this idea of fear. There's no way you could possibly do it yourself, and so you need this fully automated thing to do something that doesn't even involve any risk anyway. And that is really it's working in a different context in which consumers are perhaps less confident in their own skills or see their relationship with these companies in a different way. Although I will say that people who've been canning for a long time are really mad right now that they do not get the same kinds of personal attention from the industry that they used to in the past. And so most of that attention now is given by professionals who are working in cooperative extension programs, like we have here at Virginia Tech or at the University of Georgia. So it's shifted institutionally, I think, where people are getting that kind of personalized feedback.
And we have time maybe for one more question. And this is an urban versus rural. So it might be assumed that most of the market for the canning goods that were commercialized were pitched to a rural audience. A lot of your photos, some of them were clearly rural. Others, it's not obvious. Of course, maybe there's been a resurgence or popularity of canning or preserving in urban contexts. But can you tell us, was there necessarily more of a market in rural areas as opposed to urban, or did it shift back and forth? What have you found in your research?
Well, so there is a distinction between urban and rural canning, especially in prior decades. So canning has to exist in a particular kind of economy of you have to have abundant access to abundant produce, right? You have to have access to time. You have to have access to space in which to store things. And so all of those combined made it, more difficult for people who are living in apartments, especially if they've got like gas fueled stoves that are really expensive to do this kind of work. I would say though, I mentioned that preserving this that's more confectionery, what we would call artisanal work today, pickles, jams, and jellies, has always been high prestige. And those are also produced in smaller quantities. You need to be able to afford the sugar and everything else that goes into those. And so those have tended to be more continuously popular in urban areas among wealthier folks. But I would say, so a lot of it is access to sort of materials and time, but with the sort of resurgence of small batch canning, more and more people, and also a deep DIY ethos culture, more people who are in spaces and have access to things like community supported agriculture, farmers markets in urban spaces, it has become more of a popular thing to do in cities and small spaces. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, someone usually has to do that at least once on a Zoom call. I thought I'd sacrifice myself, so there I've done it. So about a minute left, and we do have one more question on the queue. They're showing appreciation for the way that your presentation consistently was demonstrating a deeper analysis of how the societal norms impact the validity and authority of knowledge systems. So they're asking, where else have you seen this pattern that generational or traditional knowledge is getting devalued through these commercial practices? Your presentation was looking at canning and preserving. Are you familiar with other contexts where the same pattern has been demonstrated? I don't know if they're medicinal practices or maybe clothing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that
practices.
Any kind of practice that has been any practice that goes up against industrial production, I think, is going to be enmeshed in kind of in rhetorics that try to devalue the home produced example of whatever you can buy in the store. So I think like with advertising rhetoric, that happens a lot. I think, I mean, anything that you can think of that is homemade and has a negative valence attached to it, right? You can spin it either way, right? Homemade can mean handcrafted, or it can mean shoddy work by people who can't afford to do something different. So it really, like the rhetorical frameworks in which things are, I think anything really can be framed in those opposite kinds of ways.
Yeah, your point about the back and forth makes me think of the just like homemade that's sold in your grocer or freezer section. It's commercially produced, but that uses this idea of homemade, even though
Well, and
clearly it was not made at home. Right?
You can see, like with Smucker's jams and jellies, even the packaging of those approximates the ways that people, with the fabric of the paper covered preserve bottles, right? And so you had these really just aesthetic or visual callbacks to what has both been romanticized and also denigrated at the same time.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating to point to. Well, we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much, Danille, for just very interesting, fascinating discussion about the history of preserving and canning, and so much that this is really caught up with the economics, the cultural systems, what counts as knowledge, what is expertise, all of that. And you just integrated that so richly and nimbly. So thank you very much for sharing your work with us. And we want to thank our audience for joining us. I hope you look out for some of our upcoming talks as well, the rest of the semester. But thank you, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.